Friends, you have walked past it. In fact, every single one of us has ignored this building. Just through Disneyland's left entrance tunnel, there's a building that almost nobody notices. This building was the Disneyland Police Department. And when Disneyland opened 70 years ago, it opened with a real police force. As we'll learn, there were real crimes happening. But how could one of the very first buildings that you see when you walk into the park end up being one of the least documented buildings in Disneyland's 70 years? Why is there nearly no record of its existence? Brickey here, investigating the abandoned police department hiding in Town Square. Hey friends, before we get started today looking at Disneyland's abandoned police department, how about you do me a favor and don't abandon the channel? Make sure to subscribe to Hey Brickey. That is the best way to keep going on these adventures and helping me show up each and every week.
I also have good news. The 1955 Undefeated Champs hat is back in stock. Link below, grab one today, appreciate it.
Now let's get started with today's video. I'm so happy you showed up. The way Disneyland is designed, when you come in through the tunnel, there is a curve over on the train station. That curve, and with everything angled in this way to Town Square, nearly every obstacle corrals its guests into this direction. So with everybody coming in and immediately looking over to the right, nobody looked over to the left. Nobody documented what was over on the left. A building that everybody walked past has literally no history for its first few years. When you have an idea for a video and you go over to davelandweb.com, probably the largest public collection of vintage Disneyland photos, and you realize good old Dave doesn't have any photos of the Disneyland Police Department, you know you have struck obscure gold. Because most of Dave's photographs do two things. They either crop it off because nobody really paid attention to this corner, or there's a tree that shortly after Disneyland opened grew up so big and mighty that it blocked the front facade, making public record of Disneyland's police department extremely rare. And when we look at the opening day special for Disneyland, you notice the camera follows the guests through the tunnel on the left, right into Town Square. And then later, when they show the fire department, the camera stops just before documenting the police department. This would also be the same in the Disneyland People and Places movie that would be released a couple of years later. Just the camera never quite makes it over to the police department, even in people's home videos. And to make it even harder to document, just a few years after the park opened, this would become the headquarters for Disneyland guided tours. So the police department was only there for a small amount of time. Yet, like most things in Disneyland, it had big origins and a big impact on how the park would run for the next 7 decades. But here's where the mystery of the Disneyland Police Department deepens a little bit. So why would Walt's place of fantasy and escapism that many people labeled as a wonderland before it opened up, why would it need a police department? Why would there be any notion of crime and law enforcement needed? Well, the answer to this question goes back to a project long before Disneyland. This was one of the ideas for Walt's Mickey Mouse Park. In an internal memo from 1948, Walt laid out his vision: a charming little town with a railroad station, a firehouse, and yes, a police department, where guests could report lost kids, lost items, or just peek into a jail. This is one of the early documents that Walt wasn't just building attractions, he was creating a world that felt real. Walt was making his own little city that he could drive his own trains around. And he knew that certain buildings, even if they weren't used in the way that they were labeled, they would add an enormous amount of credibility to the illusion. Meaning that the best way to make your little city feel real is for the first things for people to notice: a police department, a city hall, and a firehouse. These are items easily recognizable from our real world, and it instantly set the tone that Disneyland was its own little city and not a carnival or an amusement park. This was the advent of the theme park. But this brings us to a real world problem that Walt ran into in the opening days. Disneyland had a crime wave. You see, before Disneyland opened, it was attracting thousands of onlookers. By March, 7,000 people had showed up to see Disneyland. But after March, nearly 10,000 families would show up every weekend to see what Walt was building in the orange groves of Anaheim, with thousands of people going to look at the construction project that was then around $17 million. There was a lot of materials that were just out here that somebody needed to babysit. Anaheim at this time was a quiet little farm town. Anaheim's police force had 2 jail cells, and its officers were expected to use their own personal vehicles. Walt needed a solution and protection, and he needed it fast. Enter Irwin W. Smith, a 27-year veteran of the LAPD who became the first police chief of Disneyland. His job? To build and train a 35-man police force to keep the park safe. But would the 35-man police department use this space as their actual HQ? So was it a police department or just a sign? In 1955, Disneyland Guide Map listed police right next to First Aid, Lost and Found, and City Hall. Directly next to the City Hall stood a building marked Disneyland Police Department. The white globes out front said police across them. There was no handrail back then, live dangerously. And there's also no records of arrests being made here, although there were a lot of arrests in Disneyland's opening weeks. So there's 2 things happening here at once. Disneyland has an actual police department, and they have a police department building. But what they're cleverly doing is setting the police presence to give people a sense of calm, reassurance, and also make the park feel more authentic, but they're not actually letting the guests see the police force so they can get lost in the escapism of Disneyland. Because the actual police officers or cast members you would see dressed like police officers, they were entertainers, instantly making you feel like this was a safe, funny place to visit. It was a town where crime was a little funny, even though, as we'll learn, there were real crimes happening. The humor added to the police that you would see was a way to make Main Street feel like it didn't need law enforcement. It felt like stepping into a warm memory and stepping out of the city. Instead of seeing clothed officers, you would see the Keystone Cops, a musical group dressed in old-time police uniforms, playing their saxophones, and doing all kinds of comedy bits with guests. Even though this building isn't documented, the Keystone Cops are heavily documented. They seem to be a fan favorite of the time. During parades, an old-fashioned cop would even direct traffic where Main Street meets its town square. These renditions of police officers was all to create the charm of vintage Americana without making anything feeling too threatening. But behind the scenes, real law enforcement was indeed pounding the pavement. Even though this illusion did work to make Disneyland guests feel comfortable here, real crime did show up. Because within the opening days of Disneyland, pickpockets began working the crowds in teams, coming down from Los Angeles, preying on innocent folks that are just walking around Disneyland in total amazement, not understanding that somebody else was ready to take their items out of their pockets. Professional thieves also started doing short change scams, targeting cashiers and stores in their booths, knowing that the Disneyland cashiers were newly trained and overwhelmed by the volume of crowds. Therefore, they could pull scams on them where they confuse them and get way more change back for their purchase than what they were entitled to. The Disneyland police force instantly went back to some of their colleagues at the LAPD police force, bringing down some of their specialists that knew exactly who the big crews of scammers were. And this is where modern day Disney security starts to take its shape. Even though these were real LAPD officers and the Disneyland police force, they were all wearing plain clothes, and they stationed them at the gates and the exit. They were just looking for recognizable characters known to be thieves. What they did was they rounded up all of these people, they arrested them, and instantly set out the notion that if you go to Disneyland and you try to steal, you will get arrested and you will go to jail. The operation was invisible to the Disneyland guests. They saw the police department, they felt good about where they were at. They saw the cops inside the park, they laughed at how funny they were. They didn't know that real police work was being done invisibly right in front of their eyes. And within 1 week, the Disneyland crime wave was over. But this week would teach Disney a very valuable lesson that you will see in all of its theme parks today. Law enforcement needs to be inside of the park, but it also needs to be invisible, hidden to the public's eye. Yes, there should be some indication that there are people here monitoring you, but the real police officers, the real guys here that are getting the job done, you wouldn't know them if they walked right past you. In fact, they have, and you didn't notice. So if the police department was put on Main Street to make you feel better about where you were at and to make Disneyland feel more secure, what was actually done inside of this building? Well, one of Disneyland's greatest mysteries was solved here. Before it became the home to guided tours, legendary Disneyland Imagineer Marty Sklar used this as his office for a brief moment during the police department years. And what he did was he left his front door unlocked. If a curious guest wanted to open it and come inside, he used this as a one-on-one moment to learn from the Disney guests. And in many ways, Marty Sklar, if you don't know this, he was a police officer in his own right. He was the one who enforced Walt's legacy in his absence. Marty kept Walt's legacy and his ideology of theme park design close to his heart and would be Walt's enforcer in his absence to make sure things were still done in Walt's vision as long as Marty walked this planet. But Marty's open door policy brought in a guest one day who told Marty straight up, "I want to go on the Jungle Cruise and the Mark Twain and Rocket to the Moon, but I don't want to ride any of the rides." And that's when it hit Marty. To most people, rides were cheap carnival attractions, but Disneyland had created something very different. It was about immersion, storytelling, and Disney magic. And because of this guest that came through this door and gave Marty the clarity that he couldn't see as somebody who was too close to the project, Marty banned the word rides from ever being used by Disney cast members and in print. And it was right here in the Disneyland Police Department that one of the greatest mysteries of Disneyland was ever solved. It was here that it was determined that Disney would no longer have rides. It had attractions. The Disneyland Police Department wasn't built to hold criminals or to do police work. It was built to hold an illusion. And these three main design principles not only would carry on at Disneyland, but every Disney theme park. Make people feel safe, make them have fun, and make the bad stuff happen invisibly. That was until social media showed up and everybody started filming everybody acting like a fool. But in many ways, this forgotten Disneyland building just didn't keep guests safe. It helped people figure out what Disneyland really was. It wasn't a carnival full of rides. It was a small city that had its own attractions that brought you to that city. I hope you had fun, and I want to thank all of my Magic Brickey members for making today's video possible by being a YouTube member. If you enjoy this type of content and want to continue going on these deep dives with me, consider joining the channel today. Friends, how about you check out this video right here where I show you Downtown Disney's abandoned path and why security had a lot to do with why guests lost the most efficient way to exit the park. See you next week.